welcome back to the world of Tash Mia. This episode today, we're going to bust some of those myths out there about BDSM. So let's get straight into it. So myth number one, which gets asked over and over again, or at least gets told to me, is that BDSM is always sexual. Now, I would have to say this is one of my biggest annoyances, that people assume that BDSM is purely a sexual play. I've mentioned in past episodes other reasons why people play. We've talked many times about it being a massive stress relief for people. It's also when people enter subspace, they enter a transient meditative space. So it could also be considered a meditative practice. There's other reasons. I have clients who are adrenaline junkies. I have one client who used to use skydiving as a hobby, and then he had children and he said, I just didn't feel safe anymore jumping out of planes, so I switched to BDSM. So he's an adrenaline junkie and that's why he practices. So there's a myriad of reasons, again, that you can practice BDSM. So there's a lot of outdated theories about why people practice BDSM. If you look at the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health, it was only until the version 5, I believe it was, which came out in 2013, that they actually made a distinction between someone having a mental health disorder with BDSM and someone that doesn't. And the way that they've actually now categorized that is that it is done without harm to either the person practicing BDSM and the other person who is participating with them. So as long as there's no harm and there's consent involved, it is no longer considered a mental disorder. But just think, that was only 2013 that was changed. So there's a lot of outdated beliefs about BDSM and why people practice. It's not anymore just a sexual practice and you've got some sort of sexual disorder. So myth number 2, that anyone that practiced BDSM has past trauma, and in particular, childhood trauma. So we actually know from research that there's no increased rate of people who have had trauma or childhood trauma in their past who practice BDSM versus the population who don't practice BDSM. So this is a very common myth I find that people come with. Now, there are people who practice BDSM who do have past trauma. BDSM actually has shown to be an effective tool in helping these people work through past trauma. Now, I want to just quickly note that if I ever have a client that does have past trauma and has come to me and has shared that information with me, I always make sure that they are working alongside a professional therapist, so a psychologist or a counselor or whatever trained professional therapist. Dominatrixes are not trained therapists. There might be some out there, but a lot of the time they're not trained therapists. So I would give the advice that if you are working with trauma in your practice, to make sure that person is getting adequate help. Myth number 3, people are either born dom or people are born sub, and it doesn't change. So we've talked a little bit in the past about dominant and sub roles. We've even talked about people who switch between dominant and submissive roles. So in some scenes or with some play partners, they take on a dominant role. In some scenes or with some partners, they take on a submissive role. Sometimes it can be with the same partner. Switches actually are very interesting to this theory, because if you're born dominant or sub, technically you can't cross over and switch. And you'll meet people who will describe themselves as, I'm a bottom who likes to top, which means I'm generally a submissive, but occasionally I like to play the dominant role. Or the reverse, I'm a top who likes to bottom, which means I identify as a dominant, but occasionally I like to take the submissive role. And you'll even hear people sometimes give it percentages. People will be like, I'm a 50-50, I'm half the time dom, I'm half the time sub, or I'm a 75-25. Or whatever it may be. There can be a lot of different combinations of how people identify their roles in BDSM. You're not stuck with one or the other. And just as I'm saying you're not stuck with one or the other, it actually can also evolve over time. I know people have started off as DOMs in the dominant role, and they then play that maybe for a number of years or however long, and they actually have something happen, or they go to a party, or they see something in a different perspective, and they think, hang on, I actually want to explore the submissive side, and they actually change to become submissives. This isn't uncommon. I've actually met this many times with clients, and it just means that you can't be pigeonholed to a role in BDSM. Just like in everyday life, you're going to be different characters with different people and the different power dynamics. For example, think who you are at work versus who you are at home. At work, you might be that outgoing, gung-ho person, hitting all the goals, leading the teams, a real go-getter. And at home, you actually like to take a seat and let your partner do pretty much everything, and you put your feet up at the end of the day. We all have different roles, and it's no different in BDSM. Myth number 4, that all clients are rich CEOs. You'll hear this one time and time again. Whatever you are in the boardroom, you're the opposite in the bedroom. However, it's not really the case. Now, of course, I have clients who are CEOs. I have clients who run their own tech companies. And I even have some of those clients come in and say, I like to come here and practice because it completely gets out of my everyday leadership role of high stress and just lets me completely submit to someone else. So yes, that myth does have a little bit of truth, but it's certainly not everyone who practices BDSM. I have, for example, someone who cleans hospitals an hour and a half north of Sydney who stays for months to come and have a session with me. Also, the misconception that all these CEOs are also male is another one. I see a lot of males in my studio, but I also see females and couples. So I get female clients, couple clients, male clients, and I also get different sexuality of clients, whether that's hetero, queer, LGBTI, any variation of that, I see them all. The other interpretation I get a lot of BDSM is it's a lot of older people for some reason. People assume you have to be, I think, probably over 40 to participate. I can say that you get a wide range of ages. My youngest client has been 19 years old, starting out on their journey. And my oldest client is actually into his 80s and he's been practicing for over 60 years. So you get a huge range of cross-diversity of society. It's no different in BDSM. Myth number 5 is that all doms and subs love all types of BDSM. Now, I'm a professional dominatrix, which means I have to be well-versed in pretty much most aspects of BDSM because it's my professional job. However, it is still within my limits what aspects of BDSM I practice. For example, one of my personal limits is blood play. Blood play, as the name would imply, is some sort of activity that would draw blood out of the submissive. Now, personally, I don't love blood and I don't love drawing blood out of people. So that's one of my limits. So even as a professional dominatrix, I don't practice all aspects of BDSM. Also, we've mentioned before that not all submissives or even doms are into the pain aspect of BDSM. BDSM essentially is a power dynamic exchange. And you can do this without even touching someone. So there's a huge range for what a sub or a dom may be into. You have things called rope bunnies, which is under the practice of shibari, which again is a kink in itself, but might also be part of BDSM depending on the power exchange dynamic. And a rope bunny is someone that likes to get tied up. And a rigger is someone who likes to tie someone up. And that might be the only thing that they practice within BDSM or within the kink. Also, I want to make it very clear that no dominatrix and no submissive knows all. You're constantly going to be learning in BDSM. And once you stop learning, I think that's when you stop becoming a good practitioner. So I'm always reading, I'm always listening to other people's podcasts. I'm always talking with different people and getting their perspectives. Just remember, As a dom or as a sub, you don't need to know everything about BDSM. You don't need to practice every activity there is. Just make sure you're practicing safe, consensually, and safely. So that's the top 5 myths we've debunked for today. If you've got any others you've heard about, send them through. I'd love to hear them, and I'd love debunking some more myths for you. Next episode, we're going to talk about finding your kink and how to talk to your partner about it. So in the meantime, get your kink on.